Well, good afternoon and welcome to the New America Foundation. My name is David Gray, and on behalf of our Education Policy Program, our Early Learning Initiative, and our Next Social Contract Initiative, it's my pleasure to introduce and moderate our event for today, the Next Social Contract for the Primary Years of Education, Transforming America's Education System to Embrace Early Learning. As many of you know, research shows that education investments in the earliest years of life make the greatest difference in the educational outcomes of children. Too often, however, our policymakers have not followed through on the promise and recommendations of this research. And so we believe that providing children with high-quality instruction throughout the earliest years of their schooling through policy changes at the local, state, and federal levels can lead to significant improvements in the educational outcomes of our students, citizens, and future workforce. This issue is quite timely as the Obama administration and Congress consider how to revamp education policy, and as policymakers consider the release last week of national test results showing that 2/3 of American fourth graders cannot read at grade level. So we believe it's a critical time for our nation to prioritize early learning, and that's what we're here to discuss this afternoon. As we begin, we'd like to take a moment to thank several leaders in the field, the Foundation for Child Development, the W. Clement and Jesse V. Stone Foundation, and the Strategic Knowledge Fund co-funded by the Foundation for Child Development and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation for making this event possible. Thank you. We are very grateful. Our program today will begin with Lisa Guernsey, our Director of the Early Education Initiative at New America, speaking about the recommendations of a new paper which she co-wrote with Sarah Mead of New America, called the Next Social Contract for the Primary Years of Education, which we are proud to be releasing today. Copies are available outside or on the New America website, and as you will hear, this paper calls for a bold transformation of our country's public education system to prioritize early learning. Then we're fortunate to have a strong lineup of respondents here this afternoon to comment on the paper and provide insights into the state of and opportunities in the field of early learning. Again, complete biographies of the speakers are available outside, but let me just introduce briefly Jacqueline Jones, Senior Advisor to the Secretary for Early Learning at the U.S. Department of Education, Jerry Weiss, the Superintendent of Schools for Montgomery County, Maryland, and Robert Duggar, the Chair of the Advisory Board at the Partnership for America's Economic Success. Thank you all for taking time to be with us this afternoon. And thank you all for being with us today, those who are joining us as we stream this over the internet and those who've taken time to be here today. We will look forward at the end of all of our presentations to a robust discussion and to your questions. But first, let me introduce to the podium the Director of Early Learning here at New America, Lisa Guernsey. Lisa?
So thank you, David, and good afternoon, everybody. Let's see, I'm a little shorter. I hope you all can see me and hear me okay. As David mentioned, the paper I'll be talking about today was written by me and Sarah Mead, my predecessor here at New America, who is now helping to launch a nonprofit called Bellwether Education Partners. Her new responsibilities require her to be out of town, but she wishes she could be here today as well. What I want to lay out before you today is what, as David said, we consider a bold transformation of the education system in the United States. Here at New America, we have an ongoing initiative called the Next Social Contract, a series of papers that call for a rethinking of the American social contract, those institutional arrangements that prompt society to share the risks and responsibilities of our common civic and economic life and provide opportunity and security for our citizens. This need for rethinking extends to our education system. In fact, the challenges of 21st century life, with increased globalization, scarcer resources, economic competitiveness, and the imperative of an informed, media and technologically literate citizenry, demand that we consider a new social contract for education. Sarah and I believe that this has to start with the early years. We envision a new, let me just get used to this for a second here, a new social contract. It's one that starts public education at age 3. And I mean voluntary, not mandated education for 3 and 4-year-olds, but one that is inclusive of many independent providers in a community, and one that is high quality according to the latest research on the kinds of adult-to-child interactions that help children thrive. It is one that erases the artificial divide between birth to 5 and K-12. And by birth to 5, I mean that still fledgling system of programs for children from birth or before birth to age 5. And K-12 we know well, right? But it's time to stop saying K-12. We need to be talking about pre-K-12 when we talk about public education in this country. This is also a contract that reforms the early grades of elementary school. In the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grades, we need to bring instruction more in line with children's development, providing kids with the kinds of rich, engaging, and challenging stories, projects, and instruction, kinds of things that let the genie out of the bottle, so to speak, that endow them with that magical will and desire to learn that when tended and nurtured by teachers and parents will carry them through their life. Here are a group of children. Now imagine, just for the sake of argument, that this one is 4, and this one is 5, and this one is 6. Our current social contract at the moment says that this child right here, the 4-year-old, is not worthy of public investment in what he is learning this year. His mother is on her own, say, and making maybe $35,000 a year. She can only afford to pay a neighbor down the street to look after him during the day, the kind woman, but one who has a high school diploma and who hasn't any sense of how to provide appropriate and stimulating learning activities among the many children she babysits, from babies to 5-year-olds every day. Now this child, the 5-year-old, now you might think that he would be going on to kindergarten. You might assume that his family lives in a district where a full day of kindergarten is considered part of the free K-12 system. But as the case in many parts of our country, he doesn't get that benefit. His parents will have to pay a fee if they want him to experience a full day of kindergarten. And it's not required that he attends anyway. Now this child, who's 6, well, he's covered, so to speak. His parents no longer have a bill to pay each month toward his education. But his elementary school experience feels redundant much of the time, and at other times it's just over his head. Teachers are trying to get him to read words he's never encountered before about topics that no one has ever explained to him. He's both bored and overwhelmed. He's already starting to check out. Our argument is that the highly fragmented system that we have now isn't cutting it. The social contract that governs the primary years of education needs an update. Our current institutions and the policies that buttress them are not helping us to live up to our shared responsibility for educating American children. The national reading scores released last week are just one of the signs that the system isn't working. 2/3 of American 4th graders cannot read at grade level. Their test scores show that they are not comprehending texts well enough to answer questions in a way that signifies solid grade-level reading skills. The situation is even more dire for African American and Hispanic children. 83% of Hispanic 4th graders are not reading at grade level. African American 4th graders, for them, the number is 84%. Another sign of a broken system is the mounting concern voiced in opinion pieces on playgrounds and among child development experts that kindergarten classrooms are no longer able to take into account the full range of social and physical needs of 5-year-olds. In some circles, outcry over kindergartens not providing enough project-based hands-on learning or adequate play and recess time are reaching a fever pitch. Evidence shows that a significant number of parents are holding children back from kindergarten until they are 6, redshirting them, as the saying goes. This is particularly true for boys, whose parents fear that they aren't ready to focus or keep their behavior in check for the kindergartens of today. This leads teachers to have to reckon with further variability in their classrooms. Some kids in their classrooms are not yet 5, some are nearing or already 7. Some have no experience with sitting and listening to an adult read to them. Others have had 2 years of preschool and the benefit of one-on-one conversation about a myriad of topics since the day they started to talk. Meanwhile, preschool attendance is all over the map and largely dependent on a family's ability to pay for it. Head Start, the federally funded PreK program for 3- and 4-year-olds, is open only to families at the poverty line or just above it. Only half of all eligible children are enrolled, in large part because funds are inadequate to open more classrooms that, according to law, rightly require the hiring of more teachers with high-level credentials. Waiting lists are common. Some states have PreK programs, and a small handful offer near universal programs that enable families to enroll their children for free if they want to. But nationwide, publicly funded PreK programs serve less than 40% of the country's 4-year-olds. State-funded programs cover about a quarter of them, and the numbers for 3-year-olds are far lower. Independently run preschools and child care centers are, of course, an important part of the picture. Some families that do not have access to state or federally funded PreK programs are finding these independent programs and are paying for them out of pocket. But costs are high. Tuition at a full-day child care center averages about $4,000 to $12,000 a year, depending on where you live. And those numbers include child care centers with hugely varying quality levels, many of which never have been evaluated at all and do not provide anything like the opportunities that children need in a PreK program. It's no wonder that children from working families, the near poor as well as moderate income families, are least likely to enroll their children in any sort of PreK program. Now let me stop here for a moment to define PreK. In the report, we use the word PreK quite a bit. And what we mean is a pre-kindergarten program open to children starting at age 3, in which kids are grouped in a classroom setting and are guided and taught by teachers who have set goals for what they would like the children to learn. They use lesson plans and are employing a variety of techniques and materials, books and multimedia, blocks and dramatic play, art and music resources, physical activities to help them get there. Often PreK is called preschool. Some might call it junior kindergarten. Some child care centers, typically the most expensive ones, offer PreK or preschool experiences like this within their daily routines. Now, how would all of these systems be incorporated into a transformed system? Well, I'll get to that in a moment. Even policies on kindergarten, not pre-kindergarten, but kindergarten, are all over the map. Only 11 states require districts to offer full-day kindergarten. And what's interesting is that as you look at this map, this is one area where the southern states are ahead of the rest of the country. And being from Virginia, which unfortunately is not one of the ones with the stars, but being from the South, I'm happy to say that. So since 2005, this list has grown, but by only 2 states, Delaware and Ohio. And I know that in Ohio, at least, budget woes are leading many districts to file for waivers because they don't have enough funding to pay for full-day kindergarten. Now, what about the other grades in elementary schools? Are children getting what they need there? I already showed you our country's dismal national reading scores, which provide part of the answer. But we need to reform more than reading instruction. A study led by Robert Pianta, Dean of the Education School at the University of Virginia, showed that it is highly unlikely for poor children to be in classrooms from grade to grade that rate high on measures of instructional quality. Only 10% of children are so lucky. When you take into account both the instructional climate and the emotional climate in these classrooms, that number drops to 7% for all children. A tiny fraction of children are getting a high-quality education throughout their early years. In fact, to go back to reading scores for a moment, it is actually these better interactions, instructional moments rich in language and critical thinking, that are likely to help children learn to read. If kids have never been introduced to concepts and vocabulary words that come with an exposure to literature, history, science, art, music, and geography, they may draw a blank when reading words related to those areas. Now, let me give you an example. How many of you remember the tall tale, Pecos Bill, the one about the cowboy who grew up among coyotes and lassoed a cyclone? This is something that is often read in 2nd grade. But if you have no idea what a coyote is, will you be able to read that word, let alone a cyclone? So with each of these pictures I've shown you on these slides, whether it's poor reading scores or lack of stable funding for kindergarten or inconsistent quality in the early grades, we have a reason to rethink our social contract. And here's another. The fragmented pipeline. Many of you here probably know that ed policy experts are calling for a more seamless pipeline for delivering learning and education opportunities, one that runs from the days before a child is born all the way through college. This paper describes those disconnects. In particular, it zooms in on the outdated divide between how children are taught when they are 4 and when they are 5. And we have to remember that the birth to 5 space has its own points of disconnection. It doesn't look like this so much as like this. This paper does not, however, advocate for a one-size-fits-all system in those birth to 5 years. We don't envision a system in which public schools suddenly have to make room for 3-year-olds. On the contrary, America is blessed with a rich network of community-based early childhood providers, including child care centers, family home care, and Head Start. In extending access to public education for 3- and 4-year-olds, we must take advantage of the capacity, experience, and community understanding that these programs offer. But public policies must help them improve their quality. In many cases, this means creating funding incentives that encourage them to hire more qualified teachers. And policies must promote links between pre-K programs and the public schools. Partnerships and the sharing of funds in an accountable way should be encouraged. Here, in a nutshell, is what this paper advocates for. We need to redefine the primary years, erasing the artificial divide between birth to 5 and early elementary years. Children up to the age of 8 are going through many stages of growth, physically, emotionally, and cognitively, but what holds them all together is that they are building foundational skills in language arts, mathematics, and social emotional competence that will have a huge impact on their future learning patterns and their success in life. They would be better served by a seamless, integrated system of education from pre-K up through the 3rd grade. We have scores of studies, and many of you in this room know them well, showing that high-quality pre-K programs make a big difference in children's educational outcomes. Not only do these programs give them the exposure to rich early math, language, and social experiences, but they reduce the need for special education services and have been shown to put them on the path towards college and career readiness. But this is not just about pre-K. We need to consider the learning opportunities of early childhood as extending up to the 3rd grade. It is by the 3rd grade that children need to move from learning to read to reading to learn. In keeping with that continuum, we argue that kindergarten needs to be a full day. An integrated system is much more difficult when children receive only half a day of kindergarten. Not only does it make cross-team teaching more difficult, kindergarten teachers present for only half a day at school are less likely to be considered full staff members, for example, but it also shortchanges children. Children in half-day kindergarten programs may receive less imaginative literacy and math lessons because that instruction is being crunched into just a few hours. These children need time to act out pretend play scenarios, put together hands-on projects, and engage in rich oral language activities that will build their cognitive skills and social competence. A transformed system would promote better teacher collaboration across and within grades. When teachers collaborate, they become more aware of the progress children are making after leaving their classrooms, and they become much more attuned to the activities and lessons that the children have experienced before entering their classrooms. When good data is collected, their job becomes even easier and promotes a team-oriented approach in which teachers, principals, and others in the system see themselves as accountable for the progress of all the children they reach, and they can use that data to inform instruction. A reformed early education system must include strong connections and partnerships with parents, community-based providers, and government programs that offer health, nutrition, and other services. So our public policies need to support this vision, but at the moment, they do not. So here are our high-level recommendations for changing public policy to support this next social contract. And I'm going to just read through them here, but I'm happy to take questions on them when we do the Q&A later. So the first one is to establish proficiency in reading, math, and social and emotional skills by the end of 3rd grade as a foremost goal of our educational system. To move the starting point for public education from 5 years old to 3 years old. To integrate pre-kindergarten into a reformed education finance system. This is a key. We've seen that in places like Oklahoma, it's this kind of integration that makes the seamless pre-K to 3 programs work. We recommend establishing clearly articulated, aligned, high-quality national standards for what children should know and be able to do at the end of 3rd grade and at each step along the continuum. We recommend that policies need to redefine the roles of early childhood and elementary grades teachers and principals to allow for collaboration and shared professional development, as well as equitable pay and credential requirements. And we need to diversify educational delivery to allow for the incorporation of a variety of high-quality providers in a publicly funded education system. This is about building the best possible learning environments for the next generation. When I first took this job, I had just emerged from several years immersed in the latest child development research in cognitive science and developmental psychology. We know now so much about the kinds of interactions that young children need to build strong foundational skills, about the types of environments that will help them thrive. We also know that the American students of today will be the American workforce of tomorrow. Couple these 2 points, the research and the reality, and the idea that our education system needs to prioritize the early years sounds less like a bold statement than a complete no-brainer. Of course we need to start earlier. These days, few would argue otherwise. But it's how we get to that point that requires some real rethinking and transformation. Our contract today, the current policies that guide the way our institutions deliver services to our families and children, is not going to get us there. We need a new one. This next social contract, we believe, is a good place to start. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. I know your and Sarah's paper and your presentation provides both food for thought and the fodder for many questions, which we'll be taking, as Lisa mentioned, here at the end of all of our respondents. We'll now have a moment to hear from each of our respondents. We'll begin with Jacqueline Jones. And Jacqueline, I know in your work on behalf of the Department of Education, you have a flight to catch this afternoon. We're grateful that you're here to spend some time with us as a respondent and provide your wisdom for this group. So, Jacqueline?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's very nice to follow someone who's the same height as you are, so you don't have to move things around. I'm really very happy to be here and thankful to the New America Foundation for offering me the opportunity to give remarks and to share with you some of the vision that the Department of Education has for early learning. I stand before you today as the Senior Advisor to the Secretary for Early Learning, and that is a big deal in the Department of Education because it's the first time we've done that. Not that the department doesn't have programs that address young children, but it's the first time that we've had a really focused and coordinated way of thinking about the education of young children. We take our charge from President Obama, who has set a very simple goal, and that is to regain and retain America's lead in the competitive global economy of the 21st century. And so he's asked that by 2020, this country once again have the most competitive workforce with the highest proportion of college graduates in the world. And we think that means that you must start with young children. We know that many children come to kindergarten without the skills they need to be successful. We know that we have data that says that at age 3 you can look at discrepancies in performance between certain kinds of children from certain kinds of backgrounds. And that is unacceptable because those gaps don't necessarily close easily. And so at the Department of Education, we have set for ourselves a goal of wanting to improve the health, social, emotional, and cognitive outcomes of children birth through 3rd grade. And so we are speaking of an agenda from the Department of Education that spans the continuum of what we see as early childhood, from birth through 3rd grade. That means that our work is with our colleagues in the Department of Health and Human Services, who run most of the programs for young children, and who will work with us as we look at this uncoordinated system that Lisa showed you of services and basically funding streams. I think the truth is that we all know that we don't have a coordinated system of early care and education in the country. What we have are funding streams, and our goal, as I work with my partner in crime, Joan Lombardi, is to try to really create a seamless and coordinated system. We had great hopes for an Early Learning Challenge Fund. We had a little block in the road last week, and we will find a way to move forward around that block and keep that goal really moving forward, that we have coordination of services. This is so important. But it is important to look at this entire span. And so we are looking at what happens birth to 3, what happens in preschool programs, and what happens in the K-3 arena. Inside the department, we're looking at ways in which each of our programs can really show this commitment to young children. And so if you look at Race to the Top, there was a competitive, an invitational priority. We hope it was a competitive, next time maybe, but an invitational priority to have early learning. Anyone from Delaware and Tennessee must be very happy today, but the other states have an opportunity to throw their hats in the ring and again look at early learning as a way of moving forward. If you look at the I3 competition, there is indeed a competitive priority where more points are given. If you look at programs and strategies to improve outcomes for children, in this case, birth through 3rd grade. Again, Promised Neighborhoods, another initiative, noticed to come out very soon for those planning grants, looking at the ways in which communities can come together and really serve the needs of parents, children, families from birth. And as we're talking with Health and Human Services around really crafting those activities for Promised Neighborhoods, we're talking prenatal, because it's, as you must know, modeled after Jeffrey Canada's Harlem Children's Zone, where there really are services for parents before the children are born. Tremendously important to help those parents have healthy children and then move forward with a continuum of services. So I think one of the things we want to do is to be able to say that we've called out, if you will, called out early learning and called it out in its entirety. I'm sure that you all will tell us when we haven't done that, and as well you should. If you look at the blueprint for ESEA, twice you see early learning, only twice, and I acknowledge that. That in no way reflects the department's commitment to it, but I think what we're doing is trying to figure out the ways in which we can use this opportunity for the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act to think about such things as more coordinated professional development across the K-3 and preschool world. How do we do that in a way that meets the legislation, meets the statute, and really does help teachers have a better way of coordinating what they want to do? To make sure that folks understand that you really can use Title I funds for preschool. There seems to be a lot of confusion around that. It's not confusing, you can. And to make that really, really clear. So I think what you'll see as time goes on are more sort of highlighted papers that speak to the ways in which reauthorization of Elementary and Secondary Act can be a really important initiative for early learning. And so if those of you out there have ideas for us, we are more than eager to listen to the ways in which we can use this opportunity to move early learning forward. You know, I come to the department from the New Jersey State Department of Education, where I was the Assistant Commissioner for the Division of Early Childhood, and I had programmatic responsibility for preschool through 3rd grade. And at that time, I think it was one of the few states that had done that. And the first meeting I attended after my esteemed elevation to that position, I said, "Where's my budget?" And there was silence because there was no pre-K 3 budget. There was a preschool budget. There was a K-12 budget. But the notion of how you actually take funds and target P3 was something so foreign. They looked at me as though I were quite out of my mind. So we started a lot of discussion after that. You know, we talk about aligning standards and curricula and assessments. It's not that easy. It's not just a matching task. We have to look at the phases of development, see what's appropriate where, and see how that moves forward. I think the experience I had in New Jersey was extraordinary and certainly has benefited me in this position because I realized that one of the greatest obstacles to a coordinated system of early care and education is tradition. It's simply not the way we think. Even when you don't have folks saying this is not the right thing to do, you should really back off, this is too much intrusion, we hear that also. It is not the way we're organized, and we have to start thinking more in terms of how children are organized. What kinds of strategies are most appropriate to help young children really move forward? And as we look at programs that have embraced a kind of P3 effort, we see much more coordination. We see teachers really engaging in this process. That you would have preschool teachers not knowing what the standards were at the end of third grade is not a good thing. Everyone seems to be responsible for little tiny areas. We are all responsible for children as they leave third grade and as they should be on track, as we say now, for college and career-ready success. So we're trying at the department to think through what these models look like, to see the ways in which states can give us ideas about the way they're coordinating their services and the ways in which we can provide incentives to states to really think about this continuum of services. It is not an easy task, but I think it is one that once we get there will give us enormous success. Once we start to think of young children as young children, not just as someone who suddenly entered kindergarten and became a grown-up or needed a different kind of way of teaching, but you think about the ways in which children, as Lisa has shown, age 3, 4, 5, they're not that different. I think one of the hallmarks of this stage is extraordinary variability in learning. And how do we make sure that children are not just placed in a grade, expected to behave in a certain way at a certain time on a certain day, but that we understand the variations in development. All of this with policy in mind, all of this with funding streams out there that have to be maintained and delivered. So the challenge at the policy level right now is to look at the funding that we have and see if we can create some kind of coherence. See if we can really take what we know about child development, what we know about the latest research, and see how we can make that whole. Also, we have 50 states and the District of Columbia, and there is a lot of innovation out there. Secretary Duncan is fond of saying, if you want to find innovation, don't look in Washington. He says, go out there, see what's happening in the real world of districts and schools, and see what they're doing. And so we're really trying to highlight those places that have pulled together their resources. I was out in Kansas last week, and it was extraordinary to see folks in rural communities who don't have a lot of resources, but by necessity have to pull things together. And so by necessity, they're having preschool and K-3 very coordinated. They're having their Head Start programs working together. One of the things I learned in New Jersey was that a mixed delivery system can be extraordinarily effective. All of this work does not have to happen in the context of school buildings. There are Head Start programs, there are private providers. We had a very clear notion of a common set of standards, a common purpose, and common professional development. With that, one of the I guess, happiest days of my experiences there was when we got data that said that across those 3 venues of school-based programs, private providers, and Head Start, we no longer saw significant differences in quality, that the major indicators of quality were really just very much the same across those programs. That is huge. That was huge. It took an enormous amount of work, but it meant that I didn't have to worry, and no parent had to worry about where their child was in any of those 31 districts. They were getting the best that they could as far as quality. And so I think if we come together and we come across these various delivery systems, we come across our funding streams, and we think about the ways in which children learn, we may be able to look back on this moment as a turning point in history, a time when we all laid the foundation for a new era of American innovation and growth and prosperity and care of young children, and a time when we recognize that the most precious assets that we have, our young children, are really entitled to happy, healthy, and successful lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline, both for your leadership of the department and the emphasis the department is placing on early learning. It's now my pleasure to introduce to the podium another leader both in national education policy and also in the impact that federal policy has on state and local education agencies and the kind of innovation that goes on at the local level. The Superintendent of Schools in Montgomery County, Dr. Jerry Wiest. Jerry?
So somebody keep track of the time. You're the 2-minute person? Good. I'm a school superintendent. We talk a lot. School superintendents are an endangered species, especially in the larger systems, and we have the 16th largest. We're about 20,000 more students than you would find in Delaware, for example, for the whole state. And they last about 18 to 20 months. And so in 1999, back before No Child Left Behind, I was brought up from North Carolina where I'd been merging school systems. I did the Guilford-Greensboro-High Point merger. It was all about race. It was all about socioeconomics. It was all about people who didn't want to get along with each other. And I'd done a couple of mergers down there, or a pre-merger in Durham and then the merger in Greensboro. And so before No Child Left Behind, systems were kind of left on their own. What they were able to do was choose what they wanted to target. So when I was invited to come to Maryland, Montgomery County, right outside of Washington, D.C., I asked them what they want to accomplish. They said, well, we can't agree on anything except we've been turning over superintendents on the average of every 3 years, so maybe you ought to ask everybody. So I asked everybody what they want to accomplish. The only thing I could get all groups to agree upon is they wanted their child college ready. So we chose that as the North Star. One thing, college ready. And what I had learned in my prior years, 23 years as a superintendent before coming up here, is what does that mean? If you can't define it, you can't operationalize it, and you can't make it systemic. So we lit that plane, college ready, on the tarmac and tore it apart. And here's what we found. We found that you weren't going to get there unless you figured out how to extend time. Now, we live in a community that has the second largest NEA union. They had struck before. They had sick outs. They weren't getting along and fussing. We had a board that fussed and were pretty politically oriented. So in order to do that, you had to extend time, and nobody wanted to go more than 180 days, 184 days in our case. So how do you do that? How do you get it right back down? And when we went down and looked at what down meant, it meant starting earlier. It meant starting earlier. So I looked at what was necessary to get out of college, and we started organizing our curriculum towards that. Then I looked at what our teachers were doing at each of these levels and asked them, bring them in to ask them, do some joint sharing, bring your unions in and say, under what conditions can we get 80% of our kids college ready by 2014? We set a date, we set an amount, and we set a time frame. They said, well, we're not going to get there from here unless we work together. And so we started looking at our demographics. Now, believe it or not, we're like all the other systems in America, our demographics were changing. We were 50-some% white, very much like Fairfax is today. Today, we're 38% white. We were growing in poverty. In fact, we've increased 44% increase in poverty. We were growing in not only poverty, we were growing in children who didn't speak English. 103% increase in the last 11 years. So what did we do to try to figure it out? Well, first of all, we looked at our college graduates. We went to the clearinghouse. And we went to the clearinghouse that keeps track of all the college-educated kids, and we found out what they did, our former graduates, when they were going through school. Then we looked at how to extend down into preschool, all of those elements. I sent somebody to Singapore, I sent somebody to Italy, I sent somebody to other systems in the country to try to figure out what they're doing. Here's what we found. You not only have to start early, but we didn't have the materials. We didn't have the psychometrics to measure. And frankly, we didn't have the teachers to teach. Because all the colleges and universities, when they talk about early childhood education, don't have a curriculum to train teachers in early childhood education. I joined with NCATE to survey their colleges, and I found out when they've got about 600 colleges in NCATE that teach teacher education, there was no common courses. We only found 11 universities that actually had a common core. We couldn't find any psychometrics about how to measure numeracy or early literacy. So if there's no measurements, no accountability, no teacher training, how are you going to line this up? We also had everybody in half-day kindergarten, and we thought preschool was something that everybody should take care of on their own. Besides, we didn't have the facilities for it. So what did we do? And let's just take a look at a few things that we did. The first thing we did was put a value chain together for 4 years, because we went over and studied the STAR research out of Tennessee, Sanders stuff. Good teacher 4 years in a row. We went back to preschool and we started opening 3,000 or 4,000 slots. Now we found out there were 3 problems in the preschool area. One, there was no training of the community people. So we then put together a curriculum that had materials and accountability, and you could tell where you were at and would fit the trajectory. That if you did, you could get out of college in 6 years after graduating from one of our high schools. Important. Not only graduate from high school, but get out of college within 6 years. Guilt rules us all, and so everybody felt guilty about these children that were all over the place, and so they came to training. We give all of our preschool and all of our kindergarten teachers 110 hours of training. Otherwise, we adopted a curriculum, trained for it, had an accountability system, and built a data system regardless of where the child moved, because we found out our poor children moved more often. So we had to compensate for the moving, and we had to compensate for the load. In the kindergarten, we started all-day K, but we differentiated class size. The poorer the child, the smaller the class. So in our wealthy neighborhoods, where we have really, really wealthy people, they were going to kindergarten with 1 to 24. In our poor neighborhoods, it might be 1 to 12, but no greater than 1 to 15. So we reduced class size, increased time, better materials, more accountability. We didn't have any place to put them, so we bought trailers. Any place, churches, trailers. Don't worry about the place. Worry about what you do in that place. Don't worry about the time. Worry about how you utilize the time. And the best way to utilize the time is a well-trained teacher. A well-trained teacher. The most critical factor. We bought the Ramies in from Georgetown, and they did the Abskinarian study and the Perry preschool study. They were the researchers. Well-trained teacher that follows a organized curriculum that you can keep track of the accountability. Then you will utilize the time, because what we weren't using was time well. So once we got those psychometrics, we found out that wasn't enough. So you see that's where it says ELO? We found out rich folks send their kids off to summer camp. So we started summer camps in our poor neighborhoods. Raffled bicycles, anything to get 60% of our preschool kids to come to school before kindergarten. Because we didn't want to miss one of those days. We wanted to have the same teacher, so we paid the teacher for extended time. They run the preschools. We changed principals out because we found principals had to be instructional leaders and know a lot about preschool. So we trained them and give them the support. We found out that good teachers didn't want to work for poor principals. When that all started working together, the more time started to pay off, and then we found out we needed to have after-school programs. You need to get these kids in languages, and with our ESOL population, we found out we could capitalize on the language because we learned from the Italians that these languages create good myoneural connections. And if you get them to cross and over, you can really even do more. And we were having a huge increase in Latino population, not far off of Italian. By grade 1, we started to extend the after-school program and the extended learning. The time stayed the same, but what we did in the time changed. And you can see those bars starting to get greater. By grade 1, different kinds of assessments. And we went to New Zealand and got Murray Clays. Reading recovery was an expensive program, so we just took the running record, trained everybody in the running record, and found out what the correlation was, what correlated, that if you are on what level on the running record, that you were able to do 12th grade work and college work, and built that in the value chain. We first guessed it was level 3, then we moved to level 4, now it's level 6. Level 6 on the running record. And that seems to correlate with being able to do advanced placement English when you get to high school. Now, by the time we got to grade 2, we were worried about overcoming ourselves with our own brilliance. And so we looked at a national test because we got kids coming in from everywhere. We looked at the Terra Nova 2. Give us a lot of data, a lot of information on both numeracy and literacy, and broke it down where it told things. What we found is that if you don't do your diagnostics that tell the teacher something, they can't change. If you don't embed your development right with the teacher, they can't change. If you don't make it systemic across the district, the kids move. And if you don't give them time and job understanding, it won't do that. And if it's not connected with when you graduate from high school, they won't see the relevance. We found out when you got to the Terra Nova grade 2 how weak our American curriculum is. You had to score at the 70th percentile to be on the college trajectory. We found out the whites and Asians, that's what they were doing. The African Americans and Latinos, not so much. And so when we started changing the trajectory, we started to see the weakness of the teacher training. And we had to invest a lot of money in training teachers. You can't get rid of teachers. They're your most valuable asset. What you've got to do is understand how to support them. Give them clarity. Give them a good feedback loop. Give them a way to communicate with each other. We found out teaching was a very isolated event in our county. By the time we got to grade 3, this is where you hear parents tell you that, why, my child did so well and now they don't do so well. It's all happening in this pre-K through 2. More slots, more time, better use of time, better training, more substantive, and tying up with the grade 12. Now we've developed 7 different ways of checking that child's progress all the way up through college. And we're training this in 5 languages to all of our parents. First of all, on the advanced reading, in kindergarten, you got to be on level 6, level 16 on running record. On first grade, second grade, you got to score at the 70th percentile on the Terra Nova. When you get into the Maryland assessments, it's not proficient or basic, it's advanced proficient to stay on this trajectory. We had to redo the math curriculum. It's horribly weak in our schools all over the country, horribly weak. And the reason is that most teachers have had only 3 hours of how to teach math to elementary kids. And they don't have the metrics, nor do they have the training. You got to hit algebra by grade 8. That's to get your high school math if you're going to be able to do it, because they want pre-calc. And we found out the AP was one of the best predictors because, one, it didn't limit you. You can take an AP music, an AP language, an AP test in so many different AP courses, but AP brings the rigor in. And it's predictive, and then this is what you had to have to get in our community college, the SAT scores. How we doing? Here's the reading, 6, 7, and 8, and 9. You can see there's great gains here. Now, this is kindergarten reading at level 6. When you take a look at level 3, we're in the 90-some percentile. What you do when you hit a target, just like you do with your treadmill, move it up. Now, here's really interesting. How are these kids doing? I've been there 11 years. I didn't get moved out. Okay? How are these kids doing? Because that's one of the things you've got to have is some stability over time, not to chase a lot of butterflies and bunnies, but stay the course. What's really interesting on the AP exams, these are kids who score a 3 or higher. All of the nation are African American. Take a look at that. How that's carried on. What we find in our research, and we do a lot of research on things, all day K makes a difference, all day Head Start makes a difference, particularly for African American and Latino children, particularly for children who have language difficulties or get moved around a lot. Asian, whites, Hispanics. Now, why does that make a difference? Because that correlates very highly with college graduation. Remember, I said the College Clearinghouse, we ordered the data? We've got data on over 71,000 kids who came through our system who went on to college and got college degrees. Best predictor, 3/4 of all of our students who scored a 3 or better on an AP test got a college degree, bachelor's degree, within 6 years. 59%, because of the strength of the courses, who just scored a 1 or 2 got a bachelor's degree. Looky here. On the African American population, if they took no AP exam, 17% got a college degree. But if they followed our 7 keys and just tried, 53% got a college degree. These are our kids. Now, 10,000 kids per classroom, you get a pretty big cohort here. You're changing lives. And 64% of them got. So you can take race and mitigate it if you got a good curriculum, good teacher, good program, good accountability. Thank you.
And now I'd like to invite to the podium someone who has a real passion for this early learning work, brings perspective from the private sector as well. The Partnership for America's Economic Success, Rob Duggar.
Jerry, I was very impressed with that presentation. What impressed me about it was you didn't fool around. You put kids first. That was the first thing you did, and then you involved parents. The priority was getting kids, that was your focus, somewhere, wherever and you asked the parents, what do you want? Because the number one indicator of academic success is involvement of parents. Number one indicator, running away. What I liked about what you said is, third, you used what was already proven. Best evidence, proven practices. You had quantified goals. You had performance evaluation. You knew whether you were getting what your taxpayers were paying the money for. And everything you did, which is so cool, can be applied anywhere in the country. It's scalable. Now, what is interesting about that particular profile of success is that it aligns item for item with what a group of business people and policy people, but mainly business people, 3 years ago in Telluride, Colorado, focused on, and these were the Telluride standards. For anything you do with respect to kids, if you want anything, anywhere with respect to kids, has to have 5 characteristics. First, it can't be about what the unions want. It can't be about what the superintendent wants. It can't be about what the governor wants. It has to be about what's best for kids. You put kids first. Second, you got to involve parents and families. Third, best evidence, proven practices. Fourth, quantified goals. And follow up and make sure you get what you paid for, performance evaluation. And last, the 5th point, scalability. So that in Maryland, you can see, we in Virginia can look at Maryland and say, you know what, there's some things we need to work on. Or Maryland can look at other states, and the scalability means you can scale it up and affect the lives of a lot of people. As you said, you're changing kids' lives, and you can find out how you compare to other people. The Partnership for America's Economic Success is a collaboration. It is authentically a partnership, and I can tell you for a fact there actually isn't anybody really in charge. It is a collaboration of professionals, business people, economists, marvelous people at Pew. Rob Kropika's here. He's just joined the partnership staff. It's just marvelous and not surprising. The Lisa Guernsey, someone whom we all admire, whose brain is always about 5 years ahead of the rest of us, and Rob are raising kids together. And I can assure you they're following exactly these 5 principles. Now, Why is a business guy, a 5-year hedge fund partner and former policy director of the American Bankers Association, House and Senate banking committees, Federal Reserve, why is he involved in this? And the answer is this. The problem we've got, we think of it as financial. The economy's down, budget deficits are large, got all these problems, state of Virginia's got a cut. I've been given 19 speeches in 11 states in the last 6 months. And some of these states are facing desperate situations. The day I arrived and spoke in Hawaii, the governor announced that they were cutting the public school week from 5 days to 4. That night, I was a bit improvident. I'm usually fairly careful about what I say. I was a bit improvident. And speaking to a group of business people in the part of the world that actually knows what Easter Island is, I said, Hawaii is on course for Easter Island. Those of you who don't know what Easter Island is, it's that island out in the Pacific where all that's left is these big stone statues that are kind of leaning over. And the problem on Easter Island was that hundreds of years ago, they got a culture that got committed to these stone statues, and they cut down every tree on the island. And there's nobody on that island anymore. And what we had a discussion that night, intense one in Hawaii, with the business people was that they could not function. They could not even conceive of being a leading tourist destination ever without people. How many of you people in the audience saw that wonderful film, Apollo 13? Raise your hand if you saw that film, Apollo 13. Okay, you remember when Tom Hanks, I say Tom Hanks because that's a name we really remember, he radios back to Houston. Houston, we have a problem. And then all the engineers in the white shirts and all the engineers start arguing and talking, and what are we going to do? What are we going to do? They're off in a room, and they've got a blackboard, and they're trying to figure out how they're going to get the spacecraft back to the United States, and they draw this chart. They're going to sling it around the moon. They got 45 hours to get here, and then 45 hours to get there, and then on back to Earth. And then in all the argument, some geeky engineer steps forward. Do you remember what he said? He stepped forward out of the crowd of engineers and said, people, guys, it's power. We don't have power. We don't have anything. You can't light up the parachutes. You can't start the engines. You can't run the radar system. You can't run the computers. We haven't got 45 hours. We've only got 19 hours. It's power. And then they started focusing on the problem. Today, we're talking about all kinds of problems in the United States, and the number one issue is people power. That's our problem. Here's the problem. Longer term, over the next 15 years, 30% of the workforce will retire. All these geezers like me are going to be doddering. You're going to be adjusting my drool cup. 78 million will retire. 63 million are in line to replace us. That's 25 million people that you're missing. That's a human capital gap, a human capital deficit. It means that if you expect to have an economy that's going to grow, you had better damn make sure every single one of those 63 million turns out to be productive. That's the longer-term problem. The near-term problem is this one. I think this is probably the first snapshot of human capital quality in the United States. It was done by the Defense Department in 2007. The results were announced last November. This is, many of you know, is a mission readiness study, and what it reveals is that 75% of American 17 to 24-year-olds cannot qualify to be United States Army privates or serve anywhere in the armed forces without a waiver. They can't do it because they don't have a high school degree, they have health problems, they have a criminal record, or they have persistent drug dependencies. Now, I thought that was a pretty shocking number, and I didn't believe it. And I talked to a friend of mine at Verizon and asked him, listen, can you run a big, complex, technologically advanced company. Do you believe this number? He said, yes, I believe this number. We require every employee at Verizon to have a high school degree or equivalent. And we don't just mean a kind of walk in and take the test equivalent. We need to know that they know what a high school graduate should know. Second, we require a drug test within 48 hours of receiving an offer for the job. Our people handle complex equipment. They can sell it. We don't want to have anybody with drug dependencies that is tempted to sell our stuff or to engage in transaction with cell phones with people and so forth. It can be basically scams. Third, obviously, we don't want felons. And fourth, we can do a little bit better than the Army. We don't require people to run a mile in 12 minutes. So we can go further down the health chain. Probably for us, this man told me, the human capital production system of the United States, prenatal to 18, the human capital production system, which we just heard about in is value stream terms, the human capital production system is operating at about a 30% success rate for companies like Verizon. It's operating at a 25% success rate for the United States Department of Defense. Very short term, I learned today, I did not know this until today, and I am stunned, and I don't know exactly what to do about it except to just redouble every effort that I can persuade anyone else to make to address this problem. But when someone tells me that 2/3 of American fourth graders can't read at grade level, this tells me something extremely important. Reading is not a cognitive skill. We think of it as a cognitive skill, but it is the result of being able to sit and listen. It is the result of a lot of complex social emotional skills. And what that score is telling me is that we're not doing the right job prenatal to 3, prenatal to 5, to make sure every kid has that strong capacity to trust, listen, absorb, not be sitting with an adult frightened, wondering what's going to happen. Is there going to be an explosion? Somebody's going to take me and slam my head up against a radiator. That child is listening, can actually hear the discussion about coyotes and cyclones, and not be worrying, are the guys coming back in here where they're going to be doing drugs all night and so forth and so on. What Geoffrey Canada shows us, which is the same thing what Abecedarian and Pugh showed us, and Perry showed us 40 years ago, is that prenatal to 3, that time period when people are forming neuron connections in their brain at 700 a second. Put that down. I know what time it is. When those people are forming neurons at that rate and can be easily distracted by something held up in front of them, so they can't even form a sentence correctly. When those people, when you're forming the earliest part in your life, the capacity to interact with another human being, it's not ABCs that you're learning to read. It's faces that you're learning to read. It's capacity to trust and listen and delay gratification and take turns that you're learning. So when I see fourth grade reading scores at 2/3, I know we're failing, obviously, in the cognitive area. There's no question about that. But we're also clearly failing in social emotional areas. I like this social contract idea. I like this report. I like what it's doing. It is putting kids first. It is shaking up the educational discussion, which I think is absolutely perfect. You need to take everything that's in, throw it up in the air, and let's have a whole new frame of thinking about it. Number 1, put kids first. Bring in parents. Best evidence, performance evaluations, quantified goals. Make sure you get what you paid for, and make sure it's scalable. All of that is in here. I especially like the focus on being able to understand what's happening to kids in the earliest points in their life. What we know in the business sector is a phrase called 2 Sigma. The 2 Sigma looks at processes that produce something. In this case, we're talking about producing an 18-year-old who's ready to go to school or an 18-year-old who's ready for a job. That starts in the prenatal months. It's a beginning-to-end process, and what we know in business is, or what I certainly saw as a guy walking into a business over the last 15 years, if you walked into a business and you saw them spending a lot of money on the end of the process trying to fix problems, we know for a fact they didn't invest right at the beginning of the problems. What Six Sigma says is that it is a process of continuous measurement. You look at every single step of the production process. You measure it. And once you do that, you are constantly working towards perfection. Is it achievable? No. Technology is always changing what you're doing. But if you're focused on that, you invest at the front end and you get minimum defects, often perfection at the end. Thank you. Lisa, great job. Thank you.
I'll invite our panelists to come on up and sit at the table here. Now we'll enter into about 20 minutes of question and answer. We'll start with any questions from the press, and if we have we have anyone with a microphone? Great. If you will stand and identify yourself and ask a question, a pointed question that is a brief question, because I'm sure we have a number, that would be terrific. All right? So any questions? We'll start with anything from the press.
Good afternoon. My name is Jacqueline with Education Daily. Thank you for having this panel and for releasing this report. I was just wondering what could be done with all the funding streams. We keep talking about starting at age 3 instead of 5 and kind of streaming all of the funding together. If Jones could address a little bit about where you think we're going to go with the ESC on that front, and the rest of you, if you could kind of clarify where you think we should go without the mainstreaming of the various funding streams.
All right, Jacqueline?
So we have, as Lisa showed in her chart, lots of different funding streams, and they go birth to 3, birth to 5, some go across K3. I'm not going to say that by the end of my tenure we will have just one funding stream. That's not going to happen. I don't see that. I think we're going to have these multiple funding streams for a while. There is this thing called the Congress, and they do that. But I think we can find ways to have much better ways of coordinating how we use these monies right now. I think what we're looking at are the barriers that sometimes the federal government puts up when we say to people, blend the funding streams, but they really can't. And that's a huge piece of work that certainly HHS and Ed are trying to figure out, HIPAA, FERPA, all these things that are really important. But they have tremendous implications for how you pull monies together. So the first job, I think, is to look at the funding streams and see where the gaps are, to see, if you look across departments, what amount of education funding needs to go birth to 3 given the HHS investment, and to not look as individual departments but as a federal investment. How are we looking across this continuum? That's the first job, and it's not as easy as it seems, because even in education we have programs that are hidden all over the place that sort of touch on young children, and how do we pull out those programs and understand how much money we're spending? Because quite frankly, I think our own data systems need a lot of work, trying to figure out how much we're spending. I can't give you a figure on how much we spend for Title I preschool. I can tell you that Title I reaches maybe a little over 2% of the kids, but as far as the figure, we don't have that. So a lot of this really requires great improvements in data systems on the federal level, helping states create better data systems, collecting better information, looking at those funding streams and trying to figure out how we can decrease the barriers that keep them from being blended in a more coherent way, and then trying to define what a coherent system would look like. Looking at models out there and trying to figure out how we pull these together. ESCA represents an enormous opportunity to think about the ways in which we can consolidate programs. If you look at the blueprint, there are about 38 programs that have been consolidated in about 6 big conceptual areas. And I think that's a way of trying to figure out how we can look at what kinds of things can we fund for teachers and leaders? How do we fund things for good instruction? And so I think if I'm answering your question, I hope so. But that's the way we're thinking right now.
Great. In the interest of time, we may not have all 4 answer every question, or we won't have time for other questions. Is anyone of the 3 of you, anyone want to jump in and add anything Jacqueline said?
Yeah, whatever assets you've got, you better pool them together to hit your target. The key is your target. And the children have to be ready. They don't have any choice. So you've got money, you've got human assets, and you've got your materials. So that even gives you more reason to study Six Sigma and many of the other alignment processes, so you can align whatever you have to hit that target as best you can hit it. And you have to start eliminating how your leakage of your assets is going. If your training isn't getting you a good cost-effective scalability plan that decreases variability, you better get rid of it and change it to something that does. So it's how you manage your assets. We've cut $137 million out of our budget. No small amount. We're still going on. Remember, poverty increase, language diversity increase, the racial mix changed completely, and every year our score has gone up. Better use of your assets is more important than having just more assets.
Great, thank you. All right, further questions from the audience here. Let's see, 2 questions right here. So we'll start with, yeah, great.
I'm Mitzi Wertheim. I'm a social anthropologist by training. Education's not my field, except John Dewey was my godfather, and my mother was his mentee and a pioneer in child development. So I've lived this from day one. How are you going to share these stories? I'm so impressed in hearing about what you're doing in Montgomery County. How do they hear about it in Tucson, Arizona, or Berkeley, California, or Nashville, Tennessee? And you have to tell the stories so John Q. Public can understand it. It means making it simple. I was trained by IBM on how to do PowerPoint slides. Let me just give you one. I've been with Defense for the last 33 years. I was asked to rethink education policy for the Defense Department. And I did a briefing, the chairman, Mike Mullen, came over for dinner, and I'd pulled out about 3 pages of points. I wanted to see, are these on target? And his answer, and I asked him if he'd read it, he said, Mitzi, if it takes more than 5 minutes, I'll never get to it. Mm-hmm. The academic world likes to write lots of words. Nobody has time to read them. And just a final point on that. I visited my granddaughter in Norwich, Vermont last week. And in the 4th grade, she was doing PowerPoint slides. They were learning how to pull the essence out of the story and presenting it to their class. So clearly other people are learning how to do it. The folks in your generations have to learn how to do it because nobody will have time to hear your stories otherwise.
Great. Rob, you travel around the country giving talks on this. How do we get Jerry's ideas and others out?
Well, one way we do it is we talk, and we tell stories, and we travel. Well, why don't you go to www.partnershipforsuccess.org. The partnership is focused on prenatal to 5. And there's stories there about business coalitions being formed in 10 states intensively and 24 states in total. We travel all the time. We talk all the time. I just talked to Jerry about getting together with him. I need to get the success that he's talking about, and particularly the way he's talking about it. I spoke in Phoenix, Arizona, and in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Nevada. Las Vegas, Nevada has us 3 million people, $6 billion budget, has to cut it in half in 36 months. It has to cut $1 billion out of its budget over the next 9 months. They are desperate for stories. And I went and I spoke 3 times in 3 different venues. So that's how it's happening. And the website that Rob and the rest of the Pew team that are staffing the partnership, working as hard as they can to get these individual presentations that business groups in these states are developing themselves to back the idea that if you don't invest in kids, it doesn't really matter much what else the state does. It is completely, economically, at a dead end if it is not doing what Jerry's doing, which he's talking about when parents look around the country and say, well, where do I want to live? When talented parents, they want to live in Montgomery County. They're even rethinking whether they want to live in Fairfax County. We're going to try to fix that. As a Virginian, we're going to try to fix that. We're going to compete toe-to-toe. But it's tough. It is tough. But that's really what it's all about, and people get it. And business groups around the country are getting it. So I think that there's no lack of capacity to do this.
Great. We had a second question.
We didn't come out of our shell till about year 8 or 9. Because too many false prophets come out and declare victory in year 1, 2, or 3. And they just chase butterflies and bunnies and everything just gets all messed up. And your educators turn off on that. So we had to see whether it actually worked, and it worked on a value stream. Second of all, after that, we let a book be written about us from the Harvard Business School. Okay? Very important. David Thomas from Harvard Business School, Stacy Childers from Harvard Business School, and it was published by the Harvard Education Press, and Dennis Doyle, who was an education writer. We didn't want the book to be more than 150 pages, just because of what you said, just like our 7 keys. We don't want it. We didn't want it to be a story about a heroic leader and all that kind of stuff that gets screwed up. We wanted it to be what are the essence of how to boil it down. It's called Leading for Equity. They also wrote 13 case studies. Pew is writing a case study right now in the early childhood. So we're trying to do this in a very logical, business-like approach where you don't waste money. Again, we've had to cut almost $250 million out all total, but still increase productivity and do that with increasing diversity. There are ways to go about doing this, folks. But you're not going to do it by humdrum. You've got to think of scale, quality, variability, sustainability, and replicability.
I would argue that's a process.
All right.
Generally, people don't talk
Let's have
about
the question behind it. Thanks.
I think I know Dr. Jones has to,
Yes.
to take off
Jacqueline,
and
do you
catch a
have-
flight, so I just wanted to
Yeah.
give you a chance to say anything more. And
Oh,
thank you
one of my
very much
questions,
for-
really. I just say very quickly, what is highly distinctive about this whole forum is that it's focused on system change. We're really great at sharing individual, stellar, small projects. This is fundamentally different discussion. In the early 80s, one of my board members, who was dean of the Ed School at Berkeley, I was at the German Marshall Fund, said, go to Europe, see what they're doing at youth employment. And my boss said, don't go. America's stellar at it. Well, what I discovered why we were stellar at it is the Europeans had systems that worked from early on, and we had lots of kids not working. The question that relates to you is that there's one stream of funding that is huge and I think extraordinarily dysfunctional, and that's the whole IEP learning differences money. And so that's untapped.
The
And I
IDEA
think
funding?
what?
IDEA?
Yeah, it's just I'm coming at it from both a policy and a parent perspective. I think it's a destructive line of funding, and I'd be interested in, as you think through systems from the federal level and examples in Montgomery County, it's how it's been integrated. The other question I want to say, Jerry, I actually sponsored you on a panel early in your process and came out because I was so stunned at the early thinking and design of this. And what one journalist said to me about what was happening with your leadership in Montgomery County was, this is the political question, that the real story there is what has Jerry done to persuade the rich citizens of Montgomery County to invest in the growing poor population in the south part of the county and maintain the stability to do this systemic change. And it's also in the context of a state that's had Nancy Grasmick's been the same superintendent for what must be close to 20 years now. So there's an extraordinary system of political. So the political story you didn't talk about, but may be one of your greatest accomplishments. Okay. So one of my questions is, practically, as we talk, if you're thinking systemically, what are the streams that we indicate? And do we look at streams that are wider than what we identify than Head Start, early childhood, that are dysfunctional? And how have you kind of, how do you succeed? And the other bit, very quickly,
maybe they could just
related to the system, is that the federal money is small. I mean, still the big money is state and local money. Mm-hmm. So, first of all, huge kudos for the system, to the New American Foundation, to the systemic approach. It's rare. It reflects powerful new thinking, and thank you for the forum.
Thank you.
I just want to say, we're looking at every funding source that touches young children and families, and trying to figure out the best in those to learn lessons from them. So certainly IDEA is part of it. I think there are some good lessons we can learn. There are some challenges, but I think we are trying to figure out how that works in this sort of comprehensive look at a systems approach. The Secretary is very clear. He doesn't want a series of activities that are just out there. He wants a serious commitment to real reform. And the notion of an Early Learning Challenge Fund was just that, to move forward with reform at the level of early learning and to have a real systemic change. So, as I said, that was a little bump in the road, but we will move forward, but always thinking about how we leave this with a system that is more coherent, more focused, and reaches more children and families. And I have to go. I'm sorry.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you,
very
Jacqueline.
much.
Yeah, on the political question, accountability is your friend in a political system. If you can show that it really makes a difference, and it isn't your fancy charts and graphs, it's what the kids say when they go home. There's a huge difference in the accountability in the early childhood area. If you read Lisa's report, it's right on target. Lisa's report is actually more or less how we did it, only you've got to go at it with scale, and you got to think about sustainability. Fear of failure is not your friend in a political system. You've got to put the issue on the line. You better put race on the line. You better put socioeconomics on the line. You better put, get your teachers involved early. You better get your community involved early. I mean, one of the things I did was go across the system and just move a $100,000 house or a $200,000 house around the system and change its value on a map. I mapped it out. Rather than these charts that put everybody to sleep, put it on a map. Everybody knows there. They know where poor people live. They know and then be honest about those kind of things. And always remember this, activity is not necessarily productivity. There's just so many activities and you turn people off. Fewer things done well over time with a value chain in mind that is being accounted systemically will help you reduce variability, increase your scalability, and keep track of the cost on everything, because you can do lots of things to move the bar up, but some of them are more cost effective. And the biggest asset you got is your human capital. Invest, invest, invest. Hire smart, train smarter, and keep them over a longer period of time, and invest in their quality. You'll get a better return on investment.
I think on this political question, what Jerry is saying is critically important. This says there's a contract, and what a contract means is somebody spends and somebody gets. There's a commitment, two-way commitment. Our budget is an architecture of commitment, state and federal, citizen to citizen. We've agreed to pay taxes, and we expect to get certain things back, and if there's a budget crisis, it's a crisis because literally the fabric of the society is being pulled apart because of social commitments, civil commitments are being defaulted on. This idea of rebuilding a contract, rebuilding a social contract, at its foundation has to be about people. And what we now know, whether we're talking about fourth graders who can't read and the social emotional skill implications of that, or 17 to 24-year-olds who can't qualify to be in the armed services, a fundamental responsibility of citizenship, protect your country. 25% of them can't, 75% of them can't do it without special waivers. And more longer term, we haven't got enough people to enable the economy to grow to address our deficit problem. So we definitely need to focus on people. And politically, obviously, when somebody's running for office, if they're talking about the life success of kids and they're talking about individual voters and their well-being, that's the winning way of talking about a candidacy. So we have a linkage between human capital, making it the top priority, economic priority of the United States. You can't do any of the other things you want to do. You can't have a clean environment. You can't attain energy efficiency. You can't advance in information technology. You can't achieve what you want to achieve in terms of safe bridges and social and physical infrastructure. You need people to do that. It's people power. Just like that geeky engineer said, it's about power. If you don't have it, none of this other stuff is possible. So it's very easy to focus on this politically. And once you put your mind on the idea that human capital is your highest economic priority, it's very easy to follow the evidence and know what to do. Follow the examples like Jerry's in Montgomery County. Do them all across the country. It's easy enough to study the failures. Follow the leading examples. What Jerry didn't mention, they call the book Leading
For Equity.
Leading for Equity. Was preceded by about 14 years by a book called Leading Change out of the Harvard Business School.
Yep.
They went through all the transformational steps. So if you want to change an organization, if you want to understand what Jerry did in just wonderful detail, read John Cotter's book, Leading Change.
That's great.
I want to throw in, we're going to duet here for a second. I'm not going to bother you, Lisa. One of the biggest issues is the lie that we've told Americans about getting out of high school is like the same as college ready. That's just one of many examples. Because before the knowledge-based economy took off, a high school education is all you needed. And so it was assumed that if you got a high school diploma, you could go to college because then they didn't have entrance exams or requirements. So in a very short window of time, that's all changed. Now you get a high school diploma and everybody worries about getting a diploma. I worry about what it's worth.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just going to jump in that when we talked about systems, it's just so important to think about extending this up through the third grade. I think that one of the things that we point to in this report is that we can't do it by just investing in more pre-K. And that obviously is a really big part of this, but it cannot be the only part. And so when we think about funding streams, and going back to that earlier question, we need to be considering ways to integrate pre-K into that full funding stream as part of our primary years of education so that it's not something that at the end of the day, politicians and others that are looking at a budget can say, oh, well, let's just cut off that last little part there. You know, it needs to be an integrated, part of an integrated whole and part of the
Yeah,
system.
what I like about that is that it puts the goals of what you want to have in place by fourth grade into the thinking about what it is you're doing in pre-K. What I like about this, it actually changed my thinking about this subject. So, and I don't change my thinking very easily. It changed my thinking about this subject. Obviously, the way science works is we follow the data. And the data that we had was heavily, heavily preschool oriented. Then the data led in the other direction, which was down to
and which is incredibly important.
Yeah,
Yes.
very, very important, led to levels of birth and prenatal care. Now it's leading us in the other direction. I think that this idea of thinking about education and say the early years as at least through third grade is very, very important. Because at that point, isn't it, that, and Jerry, correct me if I'm wrong, it's that point, Lisa, that we cease learning to read and then begin to read to learn.
Exactly.
Is that it?
One of the things you've got to think about is the curriculum is weak in the pre-K through 2. And what we need to do, and what we did, was create an integrated curriculum. You know, young children need a broad-based curriculum that is targeted. You just can't do numeracy and literacy.
Yes.
You've got to bring in those enriching activities that target everything, and that is not easy to do with Americans' curriculum. Because it's all over the place. It's too textbook-oriented and too segmented and too siloed. So we had to create an integrated curriculum, and then you have to have it, because once you know where you're going, then it's what are the materials that are going to get you there, and then how do I train people to deliver it and execute on it.
Can we find
Great.
that online?
Of course not. We'll sell it to you.
If you
can find most everything that I've been talking about online.
If you'd indulge, let me just let's ask that question afterwards specifically. If you'd indulge me, I realize we're bumping up against our time. What I'm going to ask you is for two final questions, piggybacked, and we'll give our three speakers an opportunity to respond to the two questions and anything else. I'm going to take the gentleman in the back there and the lady there on the end. Okay. And I apologize, we can't get to every question here, but we've got such rich resources here, and the paper is so important that I think let's go over time if you're willing to stay.
Absolutely. This question is in direct response to the established, clear, articulated, aligned. Sorry, I'm Mitchell London. I'm with Children's Progress as a formative assessment company, and established, clear, articulated, aligned, high-quality national standards for what children should know and be able to do by the end of third grade, and at each step in the pre-K to third curriculum leading up to that. And in there, you talk a little bit about assessments, and I was wondering if you can provide any details, just at even the broad level of what those assessments look like, how those assessments are unique and particular to pre-K to third in order to lead up to meeting those end of third grade summative tests.
Right, Lisa can address that in a minute, and then I think we had a question on the end there.
Thank you, Annabelle Fisher. I'm a licensed clinician who has worked at 2 school districts in Seattle and D.C., and I see one of our council members is here from Alexandria. Hi, Rob. I have, first I just want to say to Mr. Duggar, and sorry that Dr. Jones left, but to Mr. Duggar and Mr. Weiss, thank you so much for putting out there parent involvement, and 2, as President Obama has done, and I believe teachers who are getting first, second, third, fourth, fifth grades are not able to think outside of the box when they're teaching because the unions are keeping them sidetracked. So, first of all, what do you think of, I don't know, sorry Dr. Jones left, but I've worked with Head Start. It's proven. It has outcome. It's a good program. I believe that the financial guidelines for that program need to be increased so that families who make more than the poverty line can put their children into the Head Start program and stop thinking about setting up another pre-K, whatever, program and have a sliding scale. If everybody pays something, you pay for it, you own it, and it encompasses all of the stuff Dr. Jones was talking about. We provide everything to that. And the second question is, I guess to any of you, what do you think about Diane Ravage's latest book, her work on education? She's a little different, but she makes some very good points. And no one has addressed her. You keep using Harvard and whomever, and that's fine. But parent involvement, and when you get to the higher grades, I learned this working with a middle school in Seattle, setting up a substance abuse program. They don't want the parents in the school. The school principal and whomever don't want parents coming in and telling them what to do. So what would you suggest? Thank you.
Let's start with Lisa and have a chance to address assessments, and then we'll go with Rob and then Jerry.
Yeah, certainly when we're talking about aligning curriculum and standards, of course, we're also talking about assessments, and that can be a really tricky thing with the younger years. So it's an area that, number one, needs a huge amount of research, and we don't right now have a good research base on what is best for children in terms of ways to assess them that takes into account where they are developmentally. I will say that right now in a lot of districts we already have assessment happening with these young children, and it's everything from the form of a teacher who's observing whether a student has been able to kind of phonically is understanding the sounds of different letters, to whether children are holding their pencils correctly, to whether they're interacting well with others. So these kinds of assessments are going on already. The question is, are they aligned to standards? And number two, are they kind of refined enough to be able to hit this really kind of hard moments in a young kid's life? So let me just give an example. There can be a day when a 4 or 5-year-old wakes up and just doesn't want to answer a question. And their brains are not at the level to say, gosh, I know this is important, this is going to matter later, I need to answer the teacher's question. They're not there yet. So a 4-year-old may not answer a question, may actually know the material and not answer a question. So we have to have assessments that are much broader in the way that they kind of treat that. So I'll leave that there for the assessment.
You're making me feel much better about my 4-year-old. Thank you.
I don't want to talk to you at all. I suppose, and let me just mention something on the point about Head Start in terms of increasing, having more access for that. In 2007, the reauthorization of Head Start did open it up a little bit, opened the door a crack, in that now families not at poverty level, but those at 130% of poverty, have an opportunity to register for Head Start. Now, they're not given first dibs, so to speak. They have to wait until all of the slots for those families at poverty have been filled. But there was a movement to do that in the reauthorization in 2007.
Great. All right. Thank you, Lisa. Congratulations again. Yes. Rob, any final words?
Yeah, I'll just address the question of money for Head Start and money for all of these things. John Spratt, chairman of the House Budget Committee, spoke at the PAYUS conference 2 weeks ago. He was introduced by Lon O'Neill at SHRM, who announced that day, as he was introducing Spratt, that the Society for Human Resource Management was joining the partnership, adopting ideas like these to put kids first, make human capital, and pledging the 250,000 members of SHRM and investing $100,000. So it does work. You can communicate with the business community when you put the terms in the right way that they understand. John Spratt said, look, every vector of budget policy in the United States is going in the other direction. Elected officials are elected to represent their districts. If you want your district, any congressional district, or Rob Kropika's delegate city council district, if you want the district to vote kids first, you got to have, as he said, Nobel Prize winners are good, business people are better, but millions of voters is best. That's our job.
Great. Rob, thank you. Jerry.
Lisa knows the pathway. She described a few of those things when she was assessing her own child about what's important. Get off assessment and start thinking of measurement. If you've ever taken your kids or grandkids to Disney World, you got to be so tall to get on anything but the small, small world. Measurement tells you something about the individual child, and that's the key to parent involvement. ABC doesn't tell you anything about when you get a grade card. It is, what are those developmental stages that you go through, and what are those ways of encouraging problem solving, critical thinking, and all those that rich parents who have gone to college already know because they followed that pathway. The key is bringing them down to bite size to train parents, and we do that with parent academies, multiple languages, TV shows given the same time every week in a different language so people can tune in. Because what happens is the kids in Singapore, the kids in Italy, the kids in Japan, all of those kids have standards that they're working off all the way down to preschool. Everybody knows what they are. They know what the pathway, they're taught the pathway, and we don't do that in America. We differentiate. And we talk about what's developmentally appropriate. Well, what's developmentally appropriate is you can read when you got out of kindergarten. We've proven that. All kids can, given the right developmental stage. This business of K through 3, my slide, which was made in 1999, all was about pre-K through 3. You better capture those 4 years or you're losing the battle at that time. After that, it's really tough to get them on the right trajectory.
I'd like you to join me in thanking Rob and Jerry and Lisa. Thank you, friends. Thank you for being here this afternoon and for your patience. I appreciate your reading the paper and your communicating with us and being involved in these important issues. Thanks for being here. We're adjourned. Jerry, thanks very much.